Hey everyone, welcome to this week's Azure update. Yes, it is the 23rd of May, but it's also the Build 2025 edition. So there's a stupid amount of updates. Check out the Build Book of News. That has all of the various articles about what was announced. It has links to more detailed blogs. So that really is the source of truth. In this update, I'm only covering the things that are Azure related. So this is obviously not everything that was at Build. You need to go and check out the Build Book of News for that. So yes, I mean, it's a stupid amount of updates this week. This is not obviously readable, but in the description of the video, I have each of those main areas exposed. You can go and jump to maybe the area of the updates you care about the most, because there's just too many to include as part of the chapters. New videos this week. So I did a video all about the face check capability we now have with Entra Verified ID. So Verified ID is part of that decentralized identity where I own the identity in my digital wallet on my phone. But face check lets me take that another step. So as part of that credential, it has my face. And then when I want to use that credential to access something, it does a liveness detection using the Azure Face service to make sure it's really me, I'm really alive, as an extra validation. And we see how we can use that in some of the interactions with our company. Hey, I want to go and get an access package. Hey, I'm being onboarded. Hey, I want to contact the help desk and reset my account. And then a video on the top 5 scams that I think you need to be aware of. Someone I know was the victim of one of these scams, the first one. And so I wanted to just try and bring some awareness. It's 15 minutes, but this is something that I think you should go and share with, especially maybe the more elderly people you may know, but honestly, anyone can be tricked. So it's 15 minutes and I go through 5 of the most common types of scam, but being aware of those and the techniques they used, I think could help everyone. So feel free to use and share with others. So let's get to the various updates, starting with compute. So the App Service Premium v4 is now in preview. So the v4 has faster processors. It has NVMe local storage. So you get that really low latency where it uses that local storage. It has memory optimized versions, and it ranges from 1 virtual CPU with 4 gigabytes of RAM all the way up to 32 virtual CPU and 256 gigabytes of memory. App Service now has availability zone updates in GA. So what this lets me now do is I can actually specify 2 AZs instead of needing all 3 of them, and I can still keep the 4 nines SLA. So it's going to be really useful when I have maybe those smaller deployments where I just maybe had 2 instances for cost optimization. Well, now, even with those 2 instance deployments, I can still enable and use the availability zones, and I can change this setting throughout the lifetime of the instance. A whole bunch of Azure Container Apps updates. Remember, Azure Container Apps abstracts away AKS, but adds other services like Dapper for my microservices, Kida for better scaling, some network capabilities. Well, now it has premium ingress in preview. So what it's going to let me do is there's an ingress proxy. So that's how all of the traffic external to my cluster can reach my applications. And at the environment level, I can now scale that ingress proxy so I could handle higher demands, including maybe performance tests. So I use a workload profile to control the virtual CPU cores and memory used by the proxy. And I can even configure some of the settings like idle timeouts to adjust as required. I now have an Azure Container Apps Durable Task Scheduler in preview. So that's a managed workflow engine and persistent state. So think of it as an orchestrator where I need stateful chaining across the different instances I have running within my Azure Container Apps instance. There's now an ACA Aspire dashboard in GA, so that lets me view live data about my project and all of the various containers that's running it within the Azure portal. And also now we have an Azure Container Apps OpenTelemetry agent in GA. And now this is just part of the platform. I can enable this feature. The agent will then just automatically send this telemetry data to whatever target I specify that supports that open telemetry standard. ACA also now has a new Azure Functions experience in preview. So this is all about hosting functions directly on my Azure Container Apps. And what I can now do is when I create my Container App resource, I can set its kind as Function App. Now, I still have to use an image that's compatible with functions, but now functions is serverless normally. And so this will automatically scale based on the number of the incoming events. Also, now we have planned maintenance for ACA. So this is where I can control when the non-critical updates are applied. So think minor security patches, bug fixes, and new releases. Critical and urgent, they're still going to apply as needed. So what I can do with this schedule is I specify a weekly maintenance window. So a day of the week, a time, and a duration. That duration has to be at least 8 hours. And then on a best efforts basis, all of those non-critical things will be applied in that maintenance window I've specified. Helps me better plan when those outages will occur. Helps me better plan for, hey, if I've got multiple instances, how to distribute those various maintenance events. Workload profile private endpoint support is GA. So if I'm using workload profiles, which remember, let me assign specific amounts of compute and memory and GPU to apps in an environment, I can now still use private endpoints. So that's an IP address within my VNet to enable private communication, and that will work for both consumption and the dedicated plans. Also, dedicated GPU has gone GA. So my NC A100 V4 series GPUs can now be available to our Azure Container Apps as part of a workload profile. Now, it is a dedicated GPU. So that's going to be useful when I know I have a continuous use because it's not scaling down to 0. I'm going to pay for that continuous use. You will need to make sure your app is running the latest version of CUDA to take advantage of those GPUs. And I guess on the flip side of this, so the Azure Container Apps serverless GPU now has Azure AI Foundry model support in preview. So with the serverless GPU, it can scale to 0 when it's not in use. And I can now use that serverless GPU to deploy Azure AI Foundry models on my Azure Container App serverless GPU environment. So then I would only pay for the amount of GPU actually used. And Arc-enabled Azure Container Apps has gone GA. Remember, Azure Arc is about expanding the Azure control plane outside of Azure. So all of those ARM goodness things and tagging and inventory, and then other Azure services follow it. So we can Arc-enable operating systems, we can Arc-enable Kubernetes environments. So when I've Arc-enabled my Kubernetes environment, which can be any CNCF-compatible Kubernetes cluster, I can now enable it for Azure Container Apps, and it will then get those capabilities around microservices and just general containerized applications. And that's going to be really useful when I'm using Azure Container Apps in Azure, and I now want to have that consistency when things are running in Azure and when they're running on premises as well. And then the V3 of durable Azure Functions has gone GA. So the V3 uses the latest V2 Azure Storage account, uses the Azure Storage SDKs to interact. It's based on .NET 6 instead of .NET Core 3.1. If I'm using C# apps that use the in-process model, this is a breaking change. So realize I'm going to have to make some modifications to my code. Azure Functions now have Python HTTP stream support. So that's going to let me stream HTTP requests to and then receive responses from using the Fast API. And the big deal here with the streaming is it's going to let you have larger amounts of data by streaming the data in chunks. So that's now available with the Python. Azure Functions now support SDK type bindings for a number of services in preview. So specifically storage, Service Bus, Cosmos DB, and Event Hubs. And this is going to expose additional capabilities beyond the regular things we could do with the traditional triggers and the bindings. So the SDK exposes more functionality. So storage, I can work with large blob sizes. I can perform partial reads. I can perform parallel uploads. For Cosmos DB and Service Bus, I get improved performance, etc. So there's a number of benefits in using the SDK type bindings beyond what we had before. Azure Functions, now the Flex has AZ support. So the Flex consumption plan supports availability zones for increased resilience, and it supports a new smaller 512 megabyte instance size. That's smaller than the existing 2048 and 4096 sizes, so I can get better cost effectiveness. And also that Flex consumption is available in a huge number of regions now. So if I couldn't use it before, you probably can now. Azure Functions MCP support has an expanded feature set. So Model Context Protocol is everywhere right now. Remember, it's all about a standardized way for an AI application to go and talk to knowledge and tools, and then be able to relay the capabilities of that knowledge and tools to my large language model. So MCP takes care of how I talk to those knowledge and tool sets, and then also how I tell the large language model what it's capable of. And then when the large language model wants me to talk to it, that MCP protocol takes care of everything. So it's super easy for my AI app to plumb into external knowledge and tooling and let my large language model use it. Well, Azure Functions can act as an MCP server. So I've got some tooling that I'm running as an Azure function. Well, it can now provide an MCP server for that tooling just out of the box via an extension. So they're expanding the capabilities to support functions written in Java. It's also now going to return improved instructions, better metadata to better customize how the large language model will be able to interact with that Azure function-based tool that I'm now exposing via MCP. There are now network optimized virtual machine SKUs in preview. So remember, there's different SKUs of virtual machines that have things like different ratios of CPU to memory. Some are storage optimized, some have GPUs, some have high performance compute. Well, now there are ones that are optimized around network performance. It's a little N variant. So these are available for the D and the E V6 SKUs, which means they're Intel based and based on the D and the E, and then there's the little L variant of D. There's 3 different CPU to memory ratios available as part of that. So when I then use the N variant, they get 3 times the network bandwidth per virtual CPU compared to the non-N variant. They get double the number of virtual NICs for the smaller CPU sizes. So what this means is I can actually get up to 200 gigabits per second of VM network bandwidth. So when I have that need for a really high network bandwidth, it could mean, hey, just doing regular network communications, but it could also be if I'm using network attack storage, well, that communication goes through the network adapters. So these could be super useful in those scenarios. Azure Functions now has the Azure AI Foundry Agent integration gone GA. So Azure AI Foundry agents are all about providing this one place to go for everything I need to create agents. Well, now they can easily hook into Azure Functions when they need to execute some serverless tool as required. So the agent can just trigger the Azure function when it decides it needs to, and it's very, very simple to do that integration. There's a number of Azure Kubernetes service capabilities now with Defender for Cloud in preview. So one of them is Defender for Cloud now has the ability to automatically, for the AKS owned images, not custom owned images, it can now go and scan for vulnerabilities without any agent. It will identify CVEs that exist. It will provide recommendations for AKS versions, releases that have the fixes for those. It can also now gate a deployment I'm trying to perform. So if it detects that deployment is vulnerable, it will block it until there's now a known version of the image that is safe based on the vulnerability assessment, and that matches my organization's security policy. There's also now a vulnerability assessment and malware detection for the AKS nodes themselves. So if I'm an organization that has a stricter security posture confidence requirement, I can now use this for the AKS nodes themselves to get an idea of what are the vulnerabilities that exist, detecting any malware. There's also a registry agnostic vulnerability assessment available that works. It works at a runtime level of the Kubernetes environment. It looks at the images that are being used. It will collect those images from the nodes and scans them offline looking for the vulnerabilities. And I can also now, speaking of Defender for Cloud, I can onboard individual AKS clusters instead of having to, as we needed in the past, onboard all AKS clusters that existed within a particular subscription. Finally, there's now a Defender for Cloud AKS security dashboard. So all of the great insight that Defender for Cloud is giving about my AKS clusters, I have this single pane of glass I can go to get information about the vulnerabilities, the misconfigurations, the compliance status, the threat detection alerts. And now just very easy to go and hook in. And there's a graph hook in as well, so I can programmatically go and get that data. AKS Core Kubernetes Extensions has gone GA. So the Kubernetes in AKS is managed, but I can still add additional capabilities via extensions. And what we can now do is these extensions are plumbed in via ARM. So things like wanting to use virtual nodes, things like wanting to use the Azure Key Vault Sequence Provider and many more, I can now hook into that and expand it just using an ARM-based extension instead of the previous ways that was a lot more complicated and detached from the normal ways I would manage my AKS environment. I can now have custom certificate authority support for AKS in GA, so I can configure my AKS cluster to trust my own, probably internal certificate authority. So I can configure a Kubernetes secret in my cluster with my certificate authority information. So then if I've got things running in my AKS environment, maybe it's a private registry, a proxy, a firewall, it will now be able to trust those various certificates that are used by those services because I've plumbed in my CA as a trusted authority within my AKS cluster. I won't get certificate errors. I now have the ability to set a HTTP proxy as part of my AKS cluster. So I set the HTTP proxy as part of the AKS cluster level configuration, and it will then apply that into the nodes and the pods automatically. So when they want to do an outbound communication, it will go and use that HTTP proxy that's been automatically plumbed in for me. There's some enhancements to the AKS automated deployments in GA. So this is all about using DevOps. And so I can say, hey, when there's a commit over here, I want you to automatically build this thing and publish it out. And it worked with GitHub before. Well, now it also works with Azure DevOps. So now as part of an automatic pipeline creation, it's going to be able to do that for me. There's AKS ready templates. There's various service connectors supported. An interesting note, Azure Fleet Manager also now has in preview support for GitHub automated deployments. So if I'm using Fleet Manager for that at scale, those automated deployments are coming. The AKS tracker now shows supported versions of Kubernetes. I guess we could jump over to that super quickly. So normally it helps us check, well, how are things rolling out? What's the release order? But if I jump over to this left side, there's this AKS Kubernetes versions. If I select that, I can now see the supported Kubernetes versions for each region. It will even show me the supported long-term servicing versions. So it makes it easy to go and see exactly what is being supported from a Kubernetes environment. And funnily enough, actually, as we speak of that, the long-term servicing was all about giving me long-term support beyond the regular Kubernetes support lifecycle. Those LTS Kubernetes versions were periodic, and Microsoft will give you an additional year of support. So they're making a change now that from Kubernetes 1.28 and above, all Kubernetes versions will be available for long-term support, giving you extended security updates, etc., from Microsoft. AKS recommended services is in preview. So in AKS, in the overview menu, you'll now see a customized list of recommended services that I can easily select and then hook up via the various service connectors. And AKS managed namespaces in preview. So namespaces in Kubernetes provide a boundary of isolation for resources and policies. Normally we go and configure those via scripts. So managed namespaces lets me configure them via the Azure control plane. So then I can use portal, templates, Azure CLI. It's basically, again, about driving consistency in how I can do more and more things through the Azure control plane. And now namespace is just part of that as well. I can go and configure my namespace via my regular DevOps pipeline that's talking to the Azure control plane and implement those things. AKS Smart Virtual Machine defaults have gone GA. So when we create a node port, there's a default VM SKU is picked, and this used to be static. So what's happening now is that default, which we can still change, but now it uses a smart default. So it looks at the capacity in the region, it looks at my quotas, and will pick the most, what it considers ideal SKU as that default. So maybe I don't have to go and change it quite as often. Fleet Manager, remember, provides that at-scale management for all of the AKS clusters, potentially within my tenant. Well, now I can use DNS-based public load balancing. So DNS-based means traffic manager, so it's global. And so the different Kubernetes services I have deployed across different clusters in different regions will automatically be added as backends to a traffic manager profile. Traffic manager profiles, remember, can do things like weighting and proximity based. There's a whole set of different configurations I can have based on, hey, where I am, my distance to the DNS server, to the different backend services. It will now hook in automatically for that. Fleet Manager also has drift detection in preview. So there's actually two things. There's drift detection and takeover capabilities. So drift detection is all about the idea that, well, Fleet Manager deploys a configuration, but there's still probably going to be times that someone has permissions to deploy a change directly on a cluster. Well, now there's a drift between what exists on the cluster and what I've defined in Fleet Manager. I can get a report of the drift and then different options to remediate that. Takeover is used to, well, what do I do when I onboard a AKS environment to Fleet Manager that already has workloads on it? How do I want to handle a difference between my Fleet Manager configuration of what the workload should be and what actually exists? So there's different options in terms of like always take it over and replace, or hey, I want to make decisions on this or leave it alone. I can now configure those various things. Azure Container Registry Connected Registry has now gone GA. So this is an Azure Arc extension. Remember, Azure Arc extends the control plane. So if I have an Arc-enabled Kubernetes cluster, what I can now do with this additional extension, it will synchronize images and other OCI artifacts from my Azure ACR instance, making them available in a seamless manner on my Kubernetes environment that I've enabled via this extension. So I basically now get a consistency between the things I'm using in Azure and my Azure Container Registry and making them available to an Arc-enabled Kubernetes environment. Networking. So the VM Network Troubleshooter is in preview. This is part of the VM Overview blade in the portal. You'll see a troubleshooter tool, and basically it lets you run a diagnostic, and it will look for blocked ports and make it easily available to you. And again, I'm literally just in the Overview tab, there's the Monitoring tab, and then you'll see Network Troubleshooting, click, and you're away. Traffic Manager now has 100% financially backed SLA. So I don't know if it's been 100% SLA before. Remember, Traffic Manager is that DNS-based global balancing system. So now there's 100% SLA that I will always be able to get a response from the Traffic Manager service when I'm doing those DNS lookups. That's obviously really important when I consider that, okay, I'm using a DNS-based global balancing to direct to my various other clients. 100% SLA for that initial global balancer removes one hurdle to getting higher SLAs for my all-up solution. Excuse me. Okay, on the storage side. So Azure NetApp Files, remember that's NetApp filers running in Azure data centers, a first-party service, now has CZRR. So this is a cross-region replication and cross-zone replication. So cross-zone region replication. Because before we had them as separately. We had cross-region replication and cross-zone replication, so within the region. This lets me combine them. So I'm going to have the capability to have not only my replication across zones within the region, giving me high availability, but I can also then replicate to another region, giving me disaster recovery. So I now have those things available in preview, so I get both of those capabilities. I can also do replication across subscriptions. So that cross-zone and cross-region replication, not bound by the subscription anymore, but they do still have to be part of the same intra-tenant. So I can't cross tenants as part of that. Premium SSD v2 now has availability set support, which is kind of an interesting one. We normally like ZRS. ZRS is zone redundant storage. We always have 3 copies of any data we have in Azure, including managed disks. And what zone redundant does is those 3 copies are spread over the 3 availability zones within the region. So I get independent power cooling network control plane. But some regions don't have availability zones. So what this is letting me do is when I have virtual machines that are part of an availability set, i.e. each VM is in a separate rack, a separate fault domain. What it's now going to do is kind of an alignment, but it's now for Premium SSD v2. The disks for all of the VMs in this rack, well, they will go to one storage stamp. All of the Premium SSD v2 disks for VMs in a different rack, they're going to go to a different storage stamp. The third one to a different storage stamp. So it's avoiding the chance of having a single point of failure caused by, hey, the VMs are in different racks, but the disks will part the same storage fault domain. So now it will make sure it splits the disks in different storage stamps in the same way the VMs have removed any single point of failure. So it gives me some better resiliency where I don't have availability zones. Premium SSD v2 and Ultra Disk. Remember, these two are very similar. They both have dynamic IOPS and throughput, which can be configured separately from the capacity. And I can change the IOPS and the throughput while it's being used. They're both sub millisecond latency, but Ultra is sub half millisecond latency typically. Ultra has higher potential performance. Well, now Indonesia Central has them available in GA. Azure Files now has NFS encryption in transit in preview. So with Azure Files, normally we think of SMB. And SMB 3 and above shares, we can encrypt in transit. Now with NFS 4.1 shares, we have something called the AZ NFS Mount Helper. And what that Mount Helper is going to do is it's going to use TLS encryption for the connection by implementing an S tunnel for you automatically. So it's a wrapper. And this wrapper is available for all of the major Linux distributions: Ubuntu, CentOS, Red Hat, Rocky, SUSE, Oracle Linux, Alma Linux. So now from my Linux environment, I'll use this helper, this AZ NFS, to have an S tunnel, which is using TLS encryption between my host and the Azure file. So I'm encrypted in transit, which previously we couldn't do. Yes, it's encrypted at rest on the storage, but now it can be encrypted as it's sent over the wire as well. For our Premium SSD v2 based virtual machines, we now have GRS and cross-regional restore backup capabilities. So the backup vault, where I'm storing my Premium SSD v2 disks, can now be GRS enabled, so it's replicating the backup to the paired region. And I could also restore that to that paired region on demand. Now, database updates. So get ready. There are so many. Cosmos DB is now available in Microsoft Fabric. So we saw this, I think it was maybe last year, that they brought SQL Server to Microsoft Fabric. So now they're bringing Cosmos DB to Fabric. So that's going to be really useful when I want to work with my semi-structured data. as a document database. Now I can do that directly in Microsoft Fabric. Cosmos DB DocumentDB now has a VS Code extension in preview. So this is Cosmos DB for MongoDB because that's built off of DocumentDB. Very complicated. But there's now a VS Code extension. So if I want to be able to connect and execute queries all within VS Code, I can now really easily do that against my Cosmos DB for MongoDB vCore, all from within VS Code. The Cosmos DB global secondary index is in preview. So think of a big deal with Cosmos DB is we shard the data. That's how we get this really huge scale. And we have a partition key that identifies the shard of the data. And very often we'll use that partition key to narrow down where we have to go to do that query. It accelerates it. We use less request units. It saves us money. So what a secondary index does is it uses its own container, its own synchronous copy of the data, and its own independent partition key. So that's going to be really useful where I have a different set of interactions I require that don't include the primary partition key. And instead I need to use an ultimate. I still want those fast lookups. I still want to optimize. And it's based on a scenario where it still financially makes sense to have the data sharded and partitioned on this other key. So now that's available in preview. Cosmos DB Fleets is in preview. So what this lets me do is to create a pool of throughput. So normally for our Cosmos DB accounts, we have a certain number of request units, RUs. And we can do provision, we can do serverless, but it's for that Cosmos DB account. So what Fleet lets me do is create a pool of those request units and then put multiple Cosmos DB accounts that will share them. So if I have these scenarios where, hey, I actually need a whole bunch of Cosmos DB accounts. Maybe it's some sort of multi-tenant application, and it's kind of wasteful to give each of them their own number of request units. Well, now I can pull them together, essentially, into a Cosmos DB fleet. I can get analytics for all of the accounts in the fleet, and I can send those analytics to Microsoft Fabric, to a storage account, so I can work out what it's doing. And I can have up to 100 database accounts per fleet space. So within the fleet, I have a fleet space, which is a logical grouping of accounts within the fleet. And the pool itself can have up to 1 million request units per second assigned to it. Now, there's a separate thing. There's something called throughput buckets available in preview. So it's completely separate from this. But what the throughput bucket lets me do is think if I have multiple applications on a single Cosmos DB account. What a throughput bucket would let me do is I can assign the app a certain percentage of the request unit of the account. And if I try and exceed that percentage, it will throttle it. So now that's useful in a scenario where I have multiple apps talking to a shared container, and I want to minimize the chance of one app being that noisy neighbor and consuming all of the resource. So I do have that as a different option. Cosmos DB for MongoDB vector search has gone GA. So now that document DB used by MongoDB has a vector search. So when I need that semantic, either meaning of the data interaction, very common for natural language, very common for retrieval augmented generation we use with our AI apps. Now that's just natively available in the MongoDB Cosmos offering. Cosmos DB MongoDB DiskANN has gone GA. So that's the Microsoft research created very high performance index for those vector searches. Over 4,000 dimensions are supported as part of that is now available. And also Cosmos DB for MongoDB Entra ID has gone GA. Remember, Entra ID is the identity provider really that powers all of the Microsoft properties and many third-party SaaS applications. Well, now I can authenticate using Entra ID to my Cosmos DB for MongoDB vCore instance. And the big deal there is that think of things like managed identities, where my Azure resource has its own identity bound to it. Well, now that resource can be given permission to the MongoDB cluster, so I don't have any secrets. I don't have to maintain any secrets. It's just inherently, I am this resource. I have the ability to now connect and use that. So that's really going to help. And that's something we're trying to move to, is that identity-based access. Cosmos DB for MongoDB, the RU to vCore migration ability has now gone GA. So nearly all of the new features we talk about for Cosmos DB for MongoDB are based on the vCore solution. So I can now migrate seamlessly from the RU base to the vCore, and there's both an online and an offline migration depending on what my restrictions are. Cosmos DB serverless to provisioned has also gone GA. So if I was using the serverless option, where, remember with the serverless, I pay for a scalable amount based on my usage, but I pay a bit more for each of those things. So now for that Cosmos DB serverless, if I decide, well, actually, I'm using a fairly steady amount of resource, it would be better for me to just use the provisioned request unit model because it's cheaper per RU. Well, I can now in-place switch from serverless to the provisioned model. The Cosmos DB Azure AI Agent service integration has gone GA. And really what that lets me do is the data stored in Cosmos DB can now easily be integrated and used by the agent solutions I create in the Azure AI Foundry agent service. For example, Cosmos DB can be really useful for storing conversational history. And so a common thing we start to talk about with agents today, and especially this agentic world, is it needs a memory, a long-term memory of the things we're doing. So now if I'm writing my agent in Azure AI Foundry agent service, which many of us will now, if I need to have that memory and it can always go back when I do another task, it could store that history in Cosmos DB really easily and then recall it for the next interaction. It can start to modify its behavior. And likewise, Azure Databricks has the same kind of Azure AI agent integration in preview. So if I want to integrate with Databricks, maybe I need to do some real-time data processing. I've got a task my agent needs to do. Hey, Databricks, go do it. Or maybe I want to access data that's already in Databricks. Makes it very, very simple to do. Cosmos DB NoSQL now has phrase and hybrid search. That should be phrase, not phase. And hybrid search is GA. So phrase search is almost the opposite to vector searches. With a vector search, we care about the semantic meaning. We don't care about the exact words. We care about the meaning of what we're looking for and the meaning of the data. With phrase search, we want the exact sequence of the words, not even just match the words, maybe in different orders. I want this exact sequence found in the data. So consider product names, quotes, YouTube video titles. I want to be able to now search for the phrase to be matched. Well, now we can do that in the Cosmos DB NoSQL database. Then, I guess maybe on the other end of the spectrum, hybrid search lets us do a full text search, so a lexical search, and combining that with a vector search. So the text uses BM25, which is a text ranking, and then it combines it with the vector search, and then combines them with a reciprocal rank fusion, RRF, which is very similar to what Azure AI Search does. But now I can just do it all within Cosmos DB. So I've really got a lot of very powerful capabilities within there. There's also now a filtered vector search. Now that's part of the Azure Cosmos DB for MongoDB vCore. So instead of just doing a vector search against the entire vector database, I can apply a filter to what it's comparing against. So if I have a very large data set, maybe I can restrict it to some subset of that vector space to make it a bit more performant and again, save me money. Cosmos DB NoSQL multi-language text searches in preview. So now I can perform full text searches, not just in English, but also German, Spanish, and French. So the way this works is I set a default language, and then I can set specific languages for specific text fields. So if I need to support multiple languages, for example, I have a global audience, this will be very useful in those scenarios. And then Cosmos DB NoSQL fuzzy search and filtered vector search are in preview. So fuzzy search enables me to match when there's a typo. And so this really useful if there's user entered data who tend to have typos. And I specify a distance. And a distance is the number of edits to make it match. So a distance of 1 would mean 1 edit. Maybe it's a character has to be replaced, a character added, a character removed. Distance of 2, there could be 2 edits. So with the fuzzy search, I tell what I'm searching for and a distance that it's allowed, i.e. how off it is from that, which makes it easier to find those matches where I might have a potential user error. And also, similar to here, we now have the vector search where I can have filters. So I could route to a specific shard of the vector index to reduce the possible matches, to reduce the latency. Cosmos DB at scale dashboard is in preview. So think of a central view of all insights about my Cosmos DB instances, and I can drill down into any particular aspect, the performance. I can show any particular critical alerts. And this aggregated diagnostic logs can be really powerful. This is a preview feature. So diagnostic logs provide me super detailed information about the different aspects I go through and enable. And I ingest those logs into some target, storage account, event hub, log analytics workspace. With the log analytics workspace, remember, I pay for the amount of data I ingest. So if I'm sending a lot of diagnostic logs, that's great, lots of data, also lots of cost. So with the aggregated, it aggregates the data into 5 and 15-minute intervals. So I get a compacted view of the data, which is still useful to troubleshoot, but it's going to result in probably a 90% reduction in the amount of data, so a 90% reduction in the cost. So if I still need to understand what's happening, but I don't want to pay for all of the ingestion, I can now get that aggregated view of that. Cosmos DB document indexing via Logic App workflows is in preview. So these are pre-built workflows in Azure Logic Apps. Remember, they're those graphical workflows, serverless type capabilities. And what this will do is it will take PDF documents, Office documents, images. So it will use optical character recognition to see what data's in the image. It will chunk it up. I break it into bits that's digestible by an embedding algorithm. It will then get the vector embedding. Remember, the vector embedding is this many very high dimensional representation of the meaning of the data, which we can then go and use with natural language. So we'll get the vector embedding by calling an Azure OpenAI embedding model, and then it will take the text chunk and the embedding and put it into Cosmos DB. So then once it's in Cosmos DB, I can use it for both a text and a vector-based search. And that original content, the Logic App workflow, it works for if the data is in Blob or SharePoint. Cosmos DB now has a per partition automatic failover. So partitions, remember, they're all about allowing me to have the data distributed. And with active, I can have many active copies of any given partition. So with the automatic per partition failover, if there's an unhealthy partition, it can automatically route the incoming requests to a healthy partition so it survives any local or regional type outage. PostgreSQL Flexibles, remember the VM-based newer version of the managed Postgres database, now has semantic operators in preview. So these let me leverage large language models to understand the operational data I have, where maybe the regular SQL query engine won't understand the semantic relationship. So for example, they can be used to get a ChatGPT style response. So is true would evaluate if a natural language statement is true based on the data within the PostgreSQL database. Extract to find hidden semantic relationships in the data. Rank for semantic ranking of documents based on the query I give it. So there's a number of these semantic operators to get semantic understanding of what's within my Postgres database. There's an PostgreSQL Azure AI extension for managed identity in preview. So I've got my PostgreSQL database. There's an Azure AI extension. So it goes and talks to Azure AI service. Before, we had to have a secret for PostgreSQL to authenticate to the Azure AI service. What managed identity lets me do is the identity of my PostgreSQL database can now be used to be given permission on the Azure AI instance. No more secret has to be maintained. It increases the overall security of my solution. PostgreSQL also has a VS Code extension in preview. So now from within VS Code, I can connect to my PostgreSQL instances. I can run queries. I can manage connection profiles. I get full IntelliSense of the stuff I'm working on. It will highlight my syntax, and I get the full SQL formatting. And I can use GitHub Copilot from within my VS Code to help in the PostgreSQL interactions. So a really nice way to interact with that. And then PostgreSQL Flexible Confidential Compute in preview. So remember, because PostgreSQL is VM-based, now I can run on confidential compute instances. That gives me encryption in use. So that enhances the security of the environment, and it does work with the Intel and the AMD-based confidential compute SKUs. PostgreSQL Apache AGE, I think that should be extension. So that's part of a very cost-effective managed graph database service powered by the PostgreSQL engine. So I could use this extension as part of, for example, a graph RAG application where I care about those semantic relationships, but that is now in GA. PostgreSQL Flexible also has DiskANN in GA. We talked about this already, that Microsoft Research, very high-performing, very fast vector indexing algorithm. So my generative AI applications that are using RAG, hey, please find me the data that has the closest semantic meaning of this request, is now available with that. And this actually supports up to 16,000 dimensions. So that's way more than the 2,000 we get with the standard PG vector extension. And obviously the higher the number of dimensions we have, the richer those semantic meanings and the higher accuracy we can actually get. PostgreSQL vaulted backups have gone GA. So vaulted backups store the backup data separately from the primary storage. That lets us then get things like long-term retention. I can get things like splitting the roles to enhance security. So that capability is now GA. And Azure SQL Database JSON index is available in preview. So if I have JSON documents that are now stored in a column of JSON type, I will now be able to use JSON functions and relational operators to effectively search those capabilities. So this JSON index is actually a pretty big deal when we're working with JSON data. The SQL Server Management Studio 21 is now available. That's the primary tool we tend to use for SQL database interaction if I'm an admin or developer. It's got 64-bit support. It's got an updated installer, automatic updates, has Git integration, and critically, it has a dark theme support. So needed that. And also as part of this, there is now Copilot available within there. So now as part of, hey, I'm writing my T-SQL, I'm trying to edit my T-SQL, I'm trying to fix my T-SQL, I can use natural language to get help within the SQL Management Studio. You can also answer more general database admin type queries. Additionally, the MS SQL extension in VS Code also now works with GitHub Copilots. So separate from this, if I'm using the MS SQL extension in VS Code, GitHub Copilot will help me with SQL code. And further, the MS SQL extension in VS Code now has a schema designer. So I can edit my database tables, the relationships, the constraints, all visually within VS Code. Yep, there's more. SQL Managed Instance, which remember gives me really good compatibility if I'm from a migrated SQL Server workload. Well, there's a free offer. So it's free for 12 months. It's 720 vCore hours per month, which renews every month. Any unused credits are lost. I get 64 gigabytes of data storage. It supports up to 500 databases and includes a 7-day retained backup and includes any SQL licensing that goes with that. So it's good to go and try that out. And the Azure Managed Redis has gone GA. So Redis is often used as a caching layer, session storage, job queues, because it's an in-memory, very high-performance store. There are 4 different tiers available. So based on my performance, my memory requirements, I can pick the one that makes the most sense for me. Miscellaneous. So the Azure Carbon Optimization has gone GA. So this is all about understanding with my Azure resources, what is my environmental impact? So if I have certain sustainability goals within my organization, this helps me see what are my carbon emissions. So I can track emissions in a very similar manner to how I would track cost. Azure Load Testing now has AI-driven actionable insights in preview. So remember, Azure Load Testing lets me apply huge amounts of compute capacity to stress test my applications based on a script, whatever I require against my apps. Well, now as part of that, I get AI-driven insights from those tests. So it can help me identify and resolve my performance issues. So it will do a root cause analysis of it, and then give me recommendations on how I can fix the problem. This is not Azure, but I don't know, more and more of us are probably using GitHub Copilot as part of our interactions with Azure. So the coding agent is now available in preview. So before, we've always had the idea of GitHub Copilot helps us as our assistant. This is moving it now more into a peer programmer for us. So I can actually, for example, assign it tasks to do. If I have a certain item, I can assign it to my GitHub coding agent, and it will autonomously go off and work on it, do the code change, create a pull request, and I can then review and pull it into my work. So I can actually go and assign it tasks to do. The GitHub Copilot for Azure has gone GA. So there's extensions available for GitHub Copilot, which gives it specific knowledge about the broader ecosystem. Because as a developer, I tend to do more than just my code today. I work in different tools, AIs, cloud, third-party SaaS services. So extensions gives GitHub Copilot knowledge of those other things. So the Azure extension gives it knowledge about Azure, the documentation, it understands my subscriptions, my resources. So in GitHub Copilot, I can just say, hey, at Azure, and then my request, and it will be grounded in the Azure docs, grounded in my subscription, to help give us very specific help around Azure. There were a large number of Azure AI Foundry updates. It's a developer conference, built as a developer conference, and so AI is everywhere. Lots of things in GA. So the agent service went GA. So this is all about creating agents, including multi-agent solutions, which is the big thing right now. Now, one of the things it has is MCP support. So Model Context Protocol is that standard way that I, as an AI app, can go and talk to my tools and my knowledge and express it to the large language model. A2A is agent to agent. It's a way for an agent to explain to another agent who it is, what it can do. Think of it like giving a calling card and giving it to other agents. So it explains what I can do, and it gives the protocol of how they can talk and authenticate. So that's part of it. It easily integrates with many knowledge sources, Bing, Fabric, SharePoint, and many, many more. And they've also merged semantic kernel and AutoGen together. AutoGen was always the more cutting edge, and then semantic kernel was the production enterprise. But they built off of each other, and it confused people. So they've really kind of merged those things in. Fine-tuning in Foundry is now available for a number of models, and it can host that fine-tuned instance. Foundry observability is available. So that gives me end-to-end monitoring and diagnostics of my models, including a detailed trace log that will show the reasoning steps and the tools they called. So pretty large number of updates. I thought I'd call it out separately. So the XAI Grok 3 and Grok 3 Mini are now available in Azure AI Foundry's model catalog of like 1,900 different models. Flux Pro 1.1 from Black Forest Labs is coming soon. Also, Sora is coming soon. And one of the challenging things can be is there's quite a few models. And there's mini versions, there's nano versions, there's redesigning versions of models. And so there's now a model router, or router, depending on America versus England, for OpenAI. So what it's going to let me do is I can just send my request, my natural language request, and the model router will pick the most optimized model. So it will try and do the smallest possible model that's capable of the ask, and smaller means cheaper. And it will just do that automatically. So today, if I use this model router, behind the scenes, it's got GPT-4.1, 4.1 mini, 4.1 nano, and O4 mini. And it will just pick the right one based on my ask. Something they announced is coming very soon is today we have provisioned throughput units, a guaranteed amount of throughput tokens. But today it's very specific to a very specific model. What they talked about is what's coming is now I'll be able to leverage that provision, that reserved capacity over multiple models. And they're talking about models over OpenAI, Meta, Mistral, Grok, DeepSeek, Black Forest Labs. I'll be able to now use that provision capacity in a far more flexible way, which is great for me. Foundry Local is available in preview. So think of the AI models that can run locally. Not every model can run locally. Some of them need huge clusters of GPUs. But where it is capable of being able to run locally on my CPU or GPU or NPU, well, this will make it very easy to run those models, agents, tools on my Windows 11 or Mac OS book. It uses the Onyx runtime to facilitate those models. And it also has MCP support. So with that, I can easily call those local tools other language models. I just have to install Microsoft.Foundry Local via Winget. And I just do like a Foundry model run, I don't know, 535 mini, and it will run it. And what's really cool also about this is I can run it with Azure Arc environment. So if I have an Arc managed environment, well, I can use the Azure Foundry Local to run models on my Azure Arc environment. Microsoft Entra Agent ID. So what's now going to happen, any agent I create with Azure AI Foundry or Copilot Studio will get its own unique identity. So that's going to solve a number of challenges. So today, organizations getting this agent sprawl, they don't know what agents are out there. Well, they'll now get their own unique identity that we'll be able to see in Entra. But when they have that unique identity, we'll now be able to give them very specific permissions to tools and data. But also we'll be able to apply things like conditional access to put certain constraints on them. Microsoft DevBox had a number of updates. Remember, DevBox is a cloud-based dev workstation that's preloaded with all the required tools. So I can now use on-demand GPU resources in a serverless way when I have some AI purpose like a training or inferencing. AI resources come pre-configured. We now have an MCP server that runs as part of DevBox. So my AI app can actually easily hook into the DevBox via those MCP standards. And I can also have customizations and images for my team, and I can use GitHub Copilot to actually help me create those. Microsoft SRE Agent is in preview, so Site Reliability Engineer. So this is an agentic AI. An agentic means it's running autonomously in the background 24/7. And what this is going to do is respond and troubleshoot as issues arrive. It's going to look for security vulnerabilities. It will learn about my environment. It will track the changes so I can interact and ask, hey, what's changed in my environment? What's going on? So as we think about, I guess, our DevOps process, remember, DevOps is not just a product, it's a process, it's the people. As part of our all-up process now, I can think about having this agentic DevOps where things like this site reliability engineer will be just running all of the time, looking and helping solve problems as they come up in our Azure environment. Azure Monitor, dashboards with Grafana. I have some enhancements in preview. So basically now I can create and edit Grafana dashboards directly in the Azure portal, making it way, way simpler. Azure Monitor has a bunch of enhancements. So if I'm doing email-based alerts, I can now customize the subject so it makes it easier to understand what the alert is about. And I can have dynamic values based on the alert content. Simple log alerts is a now more intuitive experience. Remember, the simple log alerts scan each row of data separately, meaning it has a lower latency than regular logs, and it works with both analytics and basic logs. There's an AI-powered investigation. So Azure Monitor can use this to identify anomalies, provide a list of insights that I can then go troubleshoot. And something really, really cool here is on storage, we have something called attribute-based access control. So beyond the regular roles just at the data plane, I can then also more granularly say, well, not only do you have to have this role, but if the data has this value, it has to match this value of the user or identity trying to access it. So it applies additional constraints on top of the regular assignment. Well, now with Azure Monitor log workspaces, I can apply attribute-based access control on top of the RBAC. So now I could think about almost a row level RBAC capability, because I can say, hey, I'm giving you this role on the log analytics workspace, but the attributes also have to match. So, hey, the attribute in this column has to match the attribute of your account, for example, or some other condition, but I can further constrain that permission. In GA, there's a cross-region log analytics workspace replication, and the target region could be anything I want. There's also now the log analytics UI query limit increase. It's now 100,000 instead of 30,000. So from the portal, I can get way more data. Azure Monitor Prometheus has a number of enhancements. So container insights can now be powered by Managed Prometheus, not just log analytics metrics data. There's Managed Prometheus visualizations in Azure Monitor. So along with enhanced unified monitoring experience with my AKS environment, it will now power that via my Prometheus. In GA, there's community recommended alerts based on the Prometheus metrics. So critical cluster issues, reliability, performance configuration alerts, they will all be recommended. And in preview, I can get those same abilities for Arc-enabled Kubernetes. So again, based on Prometheus data, but for my Arc-enabled Kubernetes environments, i.e. my on-premise. NL Web was announced, so natural language web. So I have a website today. And many websites today have things like RSS feeds. They might use schema.org. Schema.org lets me add metadata to the data in my site. It's a standard set of definitions. And the benefit here is it enables machines to understand the content of my site in the same way humans can. So like if I was a movie site, or there's a schema.org definition for movie and actor and things like that. And then I've got the data of my site itself. So what this NL Web does is super, super easily, and it's not opinionated in how you do it, but it's going to give me the ability to have natural language search. So it's going to give me the ability to create a vector database based on my RSS feed, those schema.orgs, the data in my site. It's going to give me a way to use a large language model or a small language model to then interact with that vector database to give me the ability to use natural language to go and talk and ask about my data. But it's also an MCP server. And what it's going to expose is an ask tool. So now AI apps will be able to ask my site that I've enabled with NL Web, hey, what do you know about this? And it will go and return it. So it makes my site not only now natural language enabled for people visiting my site, and it's got some sample UIs, but you're probably going to create your own, but it also now makes it usable by any AI application that can go and ask it, hey, what do you know about this? And it will answer based on the data it has. And finally, the original China North 1 and China East 1, which were powered by 21 VNet, they're retiring. They've been replaced by newer regions. And that's it. I know I went through these super, super fast, but there was just a stupid number of updates this week. I hope that was still useful. I tried to still give useful detail. Till the next video, take care.